Good. Okay. So, well, we'll be looking at the Mudra of Fearlessness. And this morning, I'm going to give you a sort of more of an overview talk, particularly drawing on the sutta that we heard in the dedication ceremony last night, the Fear and Dread Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya. So, yeah, so fear is looked at by the Buddha because it's inevitable in life. We've got this idea that we can solve fear, that we can kind of make it go away in some ways. Not that always that easy to experience. But actually, fear is a natural response. We've all experienced fear. And particularly in the Dharma life, it comes up surprisingly often. It's almost like fear in the Dharma life. You can't really go around it. You can't avoid it. You have to go through it in some way. So we don't usually associate fear with the spiritual life. We often think of the spiritual life in terms of calm and ease. We have I always have this image of this sort of beautiful Southeast Asian monk walking calmly across some beautiful temple courtyard or something. And I always feel that's never quite my experience. Or if it ever is my experience, I feel so chuffed that it's my experience, I kind of ruin it by thinking, that guy look a bit like that fantasy image of a Buddhist I've got in my head. Actually, what we experience quite a lot of the time is fear. Yes, the calm often comes after a storm, or perhaps several storms in the Dharma life. So fearlessness is very important as a quality in Buddhism. The Buddha is regularly described as being unafraid. Very, very beautiful verses about him being the fearless one or unafraid. It's an epithet of the Buddha. It's one of the main things that we can give on the Bodhisattva path. I know some of you have been listening to the lecture that Sangharakshita gave about altruism and individualism in the spiritual life, in which he talks about the 6 gifts that one gives as either a bodhisattva or a trainee bodhisattva, and just the importance of that, of fearlessness in that list of gifts that we can give. Along with the giving of the Dharma, it's emphasized as a quality of the bodhisattva being the hero or heroine, who's developed the kind of more heroic qualities of energy and activity, skillful means and fearlessness, courage, integrity. And it's also the mudra of Amoghasiddhi, the green Buddha of the North, who bestows the gift of fearlessness. And green itself is very much associated with fearlessness. That's why you have apparently you have a green room in a theatre, which is the room that actors go to in order to calm down before their performance. And we've heard a lot maybe about forest bathing. It's a new thing. It used to be called going for a walk in the forest. Now we don't just go for a walk in the forest, we bathe in the forest, and that has restorative and nourishing properties. Except for if it's a day like today when it's absolutely heaving it down, which I realise if English is not your first language, is slang, which means it's raining extremely heavily. We have a lot of words for rain in the English language, and this is the highest order of rain. So yes, so it's a very, very important quality in Buddhism and really worth looking into in more depth. So what is fear? Fear is the emotional and physical reaction to the perception of danger or threat. So as soon as you recognize fear, your amygdala, which is the small organ in the middle of your brain, goes to work. It alerts your nervous system, which sets your body's fear response into motion. And stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline are released. Your blood pressure and heart rate increase. You start breathing faster. and the blood flows away from your heart and your stomach and into your limbs, which makes it easier for you to go into your fight or flight response. It makes it easier for you to move very, very quickly. It's also why you feel a bit nauseous or dry in the mouth, because your blood has moved away from your stomach. So what arises in a state of fear is a lot of energy, quick responsiveness, and a focus of attention. So as some parts of your brain are kind of revving up, are becoming very active, other parts of your brain are shutting down. So when the amygdala senses fear, the cerebral cortex, which is the part of your brain that harnesses reason and judgment, becomes impaired. So basically what that means is that certain parts of your brain are being activated, which are to do with your fight and flight response, and other parts of your brain are shutting down, that are to do with thinking rationally and making clear decisions. So it's very, very important response to our survival, because it enables us to act very quickly. It keeps us safe in the world. It circumvents thought, which means you don't have to think about the danger that's occurring. You can respond immediately, either by running, fighting, sometimes freezing, or in therapy, you might have come across the term fawning as well, kind of making things all right. So it's a very, very natural function of the mind and body. And because it's so immediate, it's really important to say that from an ethical point of view, it's not right or wrong. It's not an ethical, it's not a manifestation of an ethical action. It's more to do with, if you're familiar with these terms, with the bija and mano nirma, the level of conditioned arising, which is to do with your instinctual consciousness in your body. It's not to do with karma. It's not to do with willed action. So if you get in a state of fear, it's not because it's not right or wrong or good or bad or skillful or unskillful to be in a state of fear. It's the body's natural response. And it's quick. It's before thought. So because it's automatic, it can be stimulated in situations where the threat is unknown or imagined. Your fear response is conditioned. It's usually conditioned by experiences, previous experiences that you've found to be dangerous. So a situation might remind you of a situation, so a situation that you're experiencing now might remind you of a situation in the past that was dangerous. And so you respond in association with the experience that you had in the past. Your body is responding to a past dangerous situation, and it's a learnt response that is happening now, but might not actually be appropriate now. And then later on, you might find that your rational mind comes in and say, actually, no, it's all right. It's safe. This isn't the same situation as happened in the past. So just to give you a very, very simple example of that, I do really like dogs. I grew up with dogs. I'm very happy with dogs. But I got attacked by a sheepdog in one of the fields here. So that when I next see a sheepdog in the field, I've now got a new conditioned response, which is fear arises. In contact with a sheepdog, fear arises. And then it's almost like my body, I can feel it gearing up. And then a rational mind comes in and goes, no, it's fine. This dog's fine. I had a car accident a couple of years ago, and I'd always been fairly comfortable and happy driving. I used to really enjoy driving. But now if I'm on the motorway and someone comes in off the slip road and towards me, my body just goes into a fear response. which is not very helpful, and I should probably do something about. There are ways to tackle these things, but you can see that the body is keeping me safe. It's learned that there was a dangerous situation in the past. That situation is being replicated now, and I need to go into a kind of an energetic and alert response. My stress hormones kick in, my blood moves to my limbs. So it's very, very important, but it can be quite confusing because it's stimulated automatically based on things that happened in the past. It can lead us sometimes also to do things we regret. It can lead us to act quite impulsively. So yes, so there's situations of threat that stimulate the fear response. But also, I think there's a general level of fear response in society, a demanding life, a city life, where there's a certain quantum of danger. And there's a kind of anticipated fear of a possible threat rather than an actual threat, which is more like anxiety. So anxiety is when your body is responding in a fear response to a perceived threat or an imagined threat rather than an actual threat that's happening now. And the thing about fear and anxiety is that it's collective as well. So just as, you know, we're social beings, and just as when you're walking through the woods and you disturb a bird, the whole flock moves. In the same way, we're quite keyed into each other's fear and anxiety, which is also an appropriate survival response. If something's a threat to one of us, it's a threat to all of us. So there's a deep, deep conditioned response to pick up on other people's fear and anxiety in order to have a survival response to that fear and to that threat, that collective threat. I think we really saw this in the pandemic, that there was an atmosphere of fear and that we all picked up on that from each other, even collectively, even sometimes in quite mysterious ways. And one of the things that I observed about this, so it's just my observation, but one of the things I observed about the pandemic was that there was more fear in the countryside than in the city. And I thought I was really interested in that because you're much less likely to get COVID in the countryside than the city. But I think that partly it was because people have more control over their environment. And there does seem to be a correlation between the more control that you've got over your environment, the more fear you feel. Whereas Londoners are used to living, which is where I grew up, but Londoners are used to living with a certain level of threat all the time. For some reason, I just noticed that there was less fear in the city, where you're much more likely to get COVID than in the countryside around here. The way the Buddha put that is, he said, fear is born from arming yourself. I think that's a whole talk in itself, but I think it's worth reflecting on. He said, it's actually the taking up of arms that makes you frightened. It's trying to avoid fear through avoiding fear that makes you more frightened, rather than trying to work with the fear itself. If you try and create a situation where you don't experience fear, you tend to be more frightened. But yeah, something to reflect on. I won't go into it, but fear is born from arming yourself, which is the opposite than what we would think, actually. So yes, Sangharakshita talks about that kind of collective atmosphere of fear and anxiety. He said that fear is poisoning the psychic atmosphere of modern society. It's almost like our systems are constantly wired. Amygdala is always stimulated. There's always a certain level of stimulation of the amygdala, a certain level of the release of cortisol and adrenaline all the time in society. And this can lead us to have a kind of defensiveness around others and a feeling of isolation from others because other people become a threat. So, yeah, so there's a certain level of anxiety, not always in response to an actual threat, but anticipated threat, anticipated problems. And of course, you know, the media take a role in this. There's constant sense that something is wrong. When Bhante was writing about this, it was to do with the threat of nuclear war, which he wrote quite a lot about, actually. But in our society, there are other pressing issues like climate change and the failure of the economy, strong political views, dangerous political views, and control in government. All of these things can feel quite oppressive. And we've got a sort of constant sense that something is going to be wrong just around the corner. And, you know, in terms of pandemic, we've seen sometimes it can be something wrong just around the corner. It's not to say there's nothing there. So Sangharajta says, in modern life, there is something more than just the threat of the atom or the hydrogen bomb hanging over us. There is the fact that people seem unable to trust one another, have no confidence in one another, have no confidence in life itself. People are all the time shrinking as though they are about to receive a blow. They are all the time overpowered by fear. And that's a very, very strong thing to say, actually. When I reread that, I thought, gosh, he talks about his friend of his who comes from, I think, Tibet, or it might have been his friend in Kalimpong, but he comes over to the US, and he said there was this peculiar atmosphere, and he worked out later that the peculiar atmosphere was a sense of pervading fear. And it is true, we can pick up on that because we're collective beings. We can pick up on that. I remember myself being on solitary retreat and walking through a field. So I was just on solitary retreat. I was quite happy. I was doing a lot of meditation. I was going for a walk, going through a field. And suddenly I just felt this sense of fear. And there's nothing in this field. So I was looking around thinking, this is really, really weird. And I thought, well, maybe there was some sort of battle here, you know, in the past, and I'm just picking up of some ancient fear. So I climbed over the stile, went through the fear, and I turned around the corner, and what I saw was a big dairy farm. And in the dairy farm, there were literally miles of little plastic boxes where the calves have been separated from their mothers and kept in these kind of plastic boxes with just a little bit of room to put their head over and eat the hay. And there was just, I mean, it was as far as I could see into the distance in these fields. And the feeling of fear, I realized it was the feeling of fear from the farm, from that dairy farm itself. And it was palpable. I'd sensed it before I even saw it. I walked through and I was extremely upset, actually, I must say. And I saw some of the farm workers, and they had this hardened look about them, which was quite shocking to see when, you know, I'd been meditating for so long. So yeah, so there's this fear in human beings, there's a fear in animals. All the time we're shrinking as though we're about to receive a blow, all the time overpowered by fear. And of course that leads to divisions in society because we need to find someone who to polarize with, to blame for our fear. And that often becomes minority groups. So it's a bit of a bleak picture. It's going to improve from now on in. Just want you to know that, just in case you feel a bit depressed. But, you know, it takes a long time. I think that it's good to realize that this is what we're working with in the Dharma. I've noticed it takes a long time when people come here on retreat to just unwind, to just relax in the countryside, to get used to the fact that trying to lock this building is a feat in itself. It very, very rarely happens, you know, that our doors are open and that you can be free. I remember talking to some Indian friends of mine, and they came here, and I said, look, you're safe here. You can go for a walk on your own, and you'll be perfectly safe. I said, you could even go for a walk on your own in the middle of the night and you'll be perfectly safe. And I remember my Indian friends just saying, really, is that true? And then one of them went for a walk on her own. She came back and she was crying. She said, I went for a walk on my own. I've never been for a walk on my own. So yeah, so it takes sometimes a long time for our kind of stress response, our fear response, even physically, to sort of wind down and open out to others. One can feel this when you come back off retreat and you go back into the city. There's a sort of level of openness that you've cultivated from being on retreat, and sometimes quite amazing, magical things can happen. You can have all sorts of conversations that you wouldn't normally have. So yes, so we need to look at this issue of fear in the Dharma life, because what we realize that when we start practicing the Dharma is how much fear underlies our thoughts, our speech, and our action. And how much this fear response can hold us back. We find that we want to take new steps, creative steps in our lives, and we get so far, and then fear springs us back. It's almost like we're on a kind of end of a rope that takes us so far, and then there's this sense of fear that can pull us back. So it's really important to reflect when you experience that kind of fear, where you experience the sort of edge of your, well, what we'd say in English, is modern English, is your comfort zone, you know, where you feel like actually there's a step where fear arises. It might be to go on a longer retreat, or it might be to go on a solitary retreat, or it might be to give a talk, or welcome people at the Buddhist center who you don't know that well. It can be fairly terrifying sometimes. Or we might experience fear from an unknown source. I think generally in meditation, fear does arise. The way that Sangharakshita talks about this, he says, those who practice meditation will know that from time to time an experience of deep fear comes up. At first, it may be something coming from one's childhood or even earlier, but a stage may come when a more basic, primordial fear arises. Not fear of anything in particular, but a fear that goes right down to the depths of one's being, the roots of existence. This fear too, one has to overcome. So yeah, so there's a kind of collective fear in society. There's the fear of making changes, of going beyond what we've done before. And then there's this kind of more existential fear, the primordial fear, not fear of anything in particular, but a fear that goes right down to the depths of one's being, the roots of existence. I mean, those kind of fears might seem quite different, but they all come from the same source. We're afraid for ourselves. Whatever threatens our sense of self, we're afraid of. So from that point of view, Buddhism itself is very threatening. It's threatening because it's going against our preconceived ideas about who we are. Our very self is compromised. And it's very easy to look for in Buddhism for a safe space where we don't have to experience fear. But actually, the Buddhist teachings themselves are frightening. And the reason is because in life, what we're trying to do, our kind of constant project, is building the self. And the Buddha talked about these, or the Buddhist tradition talked about these, in 4 forms of building the self. We build an idea of ourselves, firstly, through our likes and dislikes. karma upadana. So with our likes and dislikes, we create a sort of sense of self by what we enjoy, what we don't enjoy. So we form an identity on the kind of music that we like, the kind of clothes that we wear, the food that we like to eat, our shoes. I think quite a lot of my identity is tied up in my shoes. What we like to do on holiday, what movies we like to watch, all those things that we like, you know, we create an identity on our likes and dislikes. There's also ditthi upadana, which is our views and opinions. So we create a sense of self on the basis of what we think, who we vote for, what kind of discussion we like to see on YouTube, what kind of news we read. And views that we have. We also create a sense on the basis of our behavior and our routine. So that's in Buddhism, that's sila vata upadana. I'll write these down in chat at the end. And this is the kind of, the behavior and routine that we have. So, you know, I'm the kind of person who gets up and meditates and has a qigong practice. I like to go for a run and then a little swim in the river. You know, there's all these kind of behavior, rites and rituals that I have in my day that give me a sense of kind of purpose and identity. And then the last sort of form of grasping is attavada, which is the underlying sense of self that subsists through all our actions and through change. We've got this idea of who is me. I think this is mainly to do, the way we experience this directly is to do with the roles that we assign ourselves in life. So I am an order member, I am a sister, I am a daughter, I'm a girlfriend, I'm an ordination team member, I'm a preceptor. You know, all those roles that we assign themselves, mother, daughter, aunt, order member, teacher, you know, accountant, whatever you do in your life, the roles that you assign yourselves. So one builds up gradually and over time a kind of sense of this is me and who I am in the world. And anything that threatens that sense of self gives rise to fear. It stimulates this response. Because it stimulates this response because our sense of self is threatened. And so we tend to stay in the confines of the self that we have built for ourselves, the self that we have created. But all the time, there's this sense of fear underneath. And if we're not careful, what tends to happen in our personality is that we build a sense of identity around the fear, and the fear becomes the center of our identity. And then we get this kind of core sense of self that's problematic, a core sense of self that's saying that something's wrong. Because we've got a core sense of self that's to do with fear. We're trying to avoid that fear, that sense of fear. And so we get a sense that actually underneath it all is this problematic being that we're trying to avoid by building up this sense of self. So, for example, we're invited to give a talk at the Buddhist Center, and where we say, no, but I'm a shy person. I'm not the kind of person who gives the talk, who gives talks. I'm the kind of person who goes at the back. We're asked to turn off our phone when we come on retreat. And well, who are we without social media telling us who we are? You know, they've worked it out basically on everything that you've ever searched to tell you what kind of things you like. It becomes reinforcing. They tell you what you want to buy. You buy it, and then they'll tell you again and again and again. And so you start reinforcing the sense of self. They tell you what you want to watch on YouTube or what you want to listen to on Spotify. So who are you without Spotify, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever it is, telling you who you are? And what are you without constant contact with your friends to reflect you back? It'd be very, very challenging to turn off the phone. And then, you know, we might think about going on solitary retreat, which is another level of well, who am I if I'm not talking to anyone at all? You know, who am I if no one's telling me what routine I have to follow on retreat and what books I have to read and what meditations I have to do? What happens in that completely open space? Or it might be that we need to engage in some difficult communication, but we say, yes, but I'm the kind of person who everyone likes, so I can't do it. You know, what if they don't like me? So yes, so we get a sense of something problematic, you know, that we've got to kind of escape a sense of fear, and by escaping the sense of fear, we build a sense of self. We build a self that's actually circling around fear. And it might be in meditation. I think I do. One way I really experience fear in meditation is that I experience positive mental states. And Sangharaj just said there's much, much more to be afraid of from spiritual and transcendental mental states than there is with the supernatural. That was just a comment he made after having 2 experiences. But he said when he had a glimpse of the transcendental, that's when he really felt fear, much more than when he saw ghosts. Anyway, if you want to know what I'm talking about, you're going to have to read Sangharaj's autobiographies. So yes, so in fear, we have arising within us positive mental states, open mental states, something that we may not have experienced before. And that's very challenging to the sense of self that we've created. We have to drop our previous narratives about ourselves. I am the kind of person who is in this way. You know, so there's something about Buddhism itself that asks us to open out beyond this constant project of self-creation and open out into something much more beautiful and positive and aware and magical and transformative. And we don't know where it's going to lead us. And that can at times be very, very frightening indeed. Who's going to protect us? If we absolutely and totally give ourselves over to metta, to love, to the greater love, who's going to protect us? There's no protection. So the Buddha really talked about the importance of looking at this fear, because it does arise in the spiritual life. And we've got this fear and dread sutta. So the fear and dread sutta starts by a visitor, a Brahmin, who comes to the Buddha and says, well, Buddha, people follow your example, and they follow your example and go into the forests to meditate. But the jungle is hard to endure. Solitude is hard to endure. Solitude is hard to enjoy. And you might lose your mind. So clearly this difficulty of fear is not a new problem. So the Buddha says, so it is. And he said, well, you know, before my enlightenment, I also considered the same thing. I thought, well, people do experience fear in the jungle, in the forests, alone. And I thought to myself, well, but I don't experience fear and dread in the forest. He said, I feel great solace or security or confidence in the forest. And the reason that I feel confidence and solace in the forest is because I'm a noble one and I'm ethical. I'm free of the hindrances, with a mind of love and peace, mindful, content, energetic, concentrated, wise. So when I'm in the forest, I experience solace and confidence and security. So what do we make of this? The first thing to notice is that the Buddha's not enlightened at this point. He's still a bodhisattva. But he does say he's one of the noble ones. So he says what he's saying at that point is that he has got transcendental insight and he is a stream entrant or above. He's seen through self-grasping, through this project of self-creation, at least to some extent. So what's there to be frightened of? If you remember, a stream entrant is someone who's seen through fixed self-view, who knows that they can change, who's committed to change, who's clear about the things they need to do in order to change. So why would they be threatened by any change to their sense of self? Why would they be threatened by losing their sense of this kind of ego project, this kind of self-creation project? So we might not consider ourselves to be one of the noble ones. Might do, might not do, who knows? But I think we can all take this reflection. And the first reflection is, what have I got to lose? You know, if you're asked to give a talk at the Buddhist Center, or you're asked to, or you want to go on solitary retreat, or you're asked to give up your phone on the retreat, what have I got to lose? All I've got to lose is my limited sense of self. All I've got to lose is my self-grasping. I might look a little bit foolish, you know, I might be a little bit humiliated. But even if that happens, that's not as important as my sense of ethics, meditation, and wisdom. So what the Buddha is saying is that there's something more important than this self-construction. And what's more important than self-construction is our practice of ethics, meditation, and wisdom. So this is what's most important to call to mind. What have I got to lose? Well, if I'm not losing my ethics, meditation, and wisdom, then I'm fine. It doesn't matter. Will it lead me to break the precepts? No, it won't. Are my ethics, meditation, or wisdom compromised? No, they're not. So in that case, there's nothing to lose. So what the Buddha is saying is that the Dharma life, the path, is of a higher value than even life itself. When I had this car accident, it was a very interesting experience for me, this car accident, because I really did think I was going to die. And I spanned 360 degrees across 2 lanes of traffic on the M4 and then hit the central barrier. So when I was sitting at the central barrier after this, my first thought was, have I broken any of my commitments? And my second thought was, am I alive? And I reflected on that afterwards, you know, because you don't have time to have reasoned, considered judgment about that. But I reflected on it afterwards, and I realized that I was very pleased that that was the order in which my reflections came, because it said to me that there's something more important than my own life, which is my commitment to the Dharma life, and that's instinctual. So I have to say, I did think I thought maybe you have got somewhere. Sometimes I doubt where I've got anywhere, but at that point I did, well, maybe I have, because I was more frightened of losing my integrity than my life. And in a way, that's what the Buddha's saying. You're protected if you practice the Dharma, because they're the main values. You're protected if you keep to what's most truly important to you. And if that's not under threat, you're fine. So in a way, we could look at this as another episode of the Buddha touching the earth. That story of, you know, Mara's attack, when he became filled with doubt, you know, have I got a right to sit at the seat of the noble ones? And he touches the earth, and the earth goddess comes to witness his practice over the years. We can also use that mudra as well as the abhaya mudra, the fearless mudra. There's that mudra of, in a state of fear, have I lost what's most truly important to me? And if that's in place, it's going to be okay. We can touch the ground of our practice. But it's not the whole story, because the Buddha, even though he said he was didn't feel much fear in the forest, he wanted to test himself. So he decided to seek out fear. He went on the full moon, the half moon, and the new moon night to terrifying jungle shrines, orchard shrines, and just to see what he was really made of. And he said that whenever there was a wild animal present, or a peacock knocked off a branch, or the wind would rustle in the leaves, then fear and dread would arise. And he thought to himself, why do I dwell always expecting fear and dread? What if I subdue that fear and dread while keeping the same posture that I'm in when it comes upon me? So if he was sitting and the fear and dread came upon him, he would stay sitting. And if he was walking up and down in mindful walking meditation, when fear and dread came upon him, he would stay walking up and down mindfully in walking meditation. And if he was sleeping, or if he was sitting, and fear and dread came upon him, he would just remain sleeping or remain sitting or standing as fear and dread came upon him. So he would remain in the same posture until he had subdued fear and dread. So what are we to make of this? Well, it's just interesting. I always find it really interesting that the Buddha would go and seek out a place of fear as part of his training. He thought it was necessary as part of your training to be in a situation of fear, to no longer avoid fear, but to work with fear. He wasn't interested in the object of fear, in taking away the object of fear. He wasn't interested in finding himself a safe space. He was interested in going into a place of fear so that he could work with it. Which of course brings to mind some of the later Buddhist tradition of the yogis or yoginis going into the cremation grounds in order to meditate. That's there from the very, very beginning, is to find a place of fear and meditate there. And he doesn't react to it. He doesn't let it take him over. He subdues it. So a lot of this, we have to work out what he means by subdue. I think there's just a couple of points to make. He's got an attitude of embodied interest and engagement in fear itself. So he's mindful of the fear itself. He's not trying to avoid the fear itself, and he's not drowning it either. So he's not blocking the fear. He's not avoiding the fear. And that's what we often do in our lives. We feel like we shouldn't feel fear, so we find an object to blame it on, and then we think the fear will go away. There's a constant kind of search to avoid fear. But fear is a natural part of life. It arises whenever we touch the unknown. It arises whenever we touch what might be a threat to our existing sense of self. We think that we can solve it. We think that if only I can get rid of this object of fear, if only I can get rid of this job, or if only I can get rid of this situation, whatever fearful situation we find ourselves in, if only I could get rid of this deadline, or if only I could get rid of this impending exam or talk I'm about to give, then I can get rid of this fear. But actually, we need to look at the fear itself, because life will always give us situations in which fear arises. And particularly the Dharma life, because the Dharma life is a threat. It's a threat to our individualistic sense of self. So the Buddha didn't block fear, but at the same time, he didn't drown in it. So he didn't become overwhelmed, he didn't panic, and he didn't indulge in impulsive behavior. We all know what that impulsive behavior is like when we're in a state of fear. You know, we can fire off that email or write that text message, or maybe quite a few text messages at 3 o'clock in the morning. If you get an email or a text message at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's never good news. So yeah, so he doesn't indulge in impulsive behavior. He doesn't wave his arms up and down and start shouting at peacocks. Luckily. So he doesn't block the fear. He doesn't drown in it. He remains in the present moment. He finds his location in the present. Because what usually happens with fear it's an anticipation of the future in terms of catastrophic imagined scenarios. So with fear, we start creating a scenario that's about to happen. And sometimes it's not just one scenario that's about to happen. Sometimes it's a whole collection of scenarios that are about to happen all at once, all with reference to some sort of brooding sense of some negative event that's happened in the past. So with fear, we tend to sort of have a sense of something from the past and be imagining a kind of whole cascade of catastrophic scenarios in the future. And no wonder it's overwhelming. No wonder we feel overwhelmed. The Buddha says, no, come back, don't move. Whatever you're doing, carry on doing it. Come back to that location in the present moment. And the present moment is always fresh and alive. We can always cope with that moment. I think it's quite a good reflection to have when we're in a state of fear. Can I hold this moment? Can I hold this moment? Can I hold this moment? And the awareness of the moment in itself helps it subside, helps the fear subdue and subside. I have had some experience of this myself. Well, you might have experienced it on retreat, particularly solitary retreat in meditation, but I also remember meditating in the city, and there was quite a rational fear that someone was just about to break into my house for various reasons. That wasn't just totally catastrophic imagination. That was a realistic possibility. But because I was meditating at that moment, I sort of slowed the whole process down and I felt the fear and I thought to myself, okay, what is fear? And I could feel the physical sensations of the fear. I could feel the nausea in the stomach. I could feel the blood moving, the heart rate increasing, the blood moving to my limbs. I could see the scenarios that were unfolding in my mind. And I remember thinking, this is a collection of physical and mental responses. And just being aware of fear itself, instead of it becoming this kind of block of reality, which is fear, it became textured. It became made up of experiences. And none of those experiences in themselves was overwhelming. And that actually it did really help that situation because the fear subdued, but I was still active and energized, and I could deal with whatever followed in a helpful and appropriate way. So what we're asked to do with fear is have that kind of curiosity and investigation, and also a confidence that we have enough resources to hold fear. In a way, that's what the Buddha had to seek out terrifying places. He realized that he had enough resources to hold whatever came up next. A faith that there is enough space in the body to hold it. And this is what we find with the abhaya mudra. The abhaya mudra, as you remember, is a very, very beautiful mudra. You could even do it either now or in meditation. The hand is to the heart. And I was thinking about the abhaya mudra. The hand is held to the heart, close to the body. It's not out in an attacking posture. It's close to the body. It's also pointing upwards. So I think there's it's in relationship to the central channel in the body. So that central sense of stability and core. And it's also in relationship to our heights and our depths, to our whole entire practice, both the ground of our ethical practice, our meditation, the understanding that comes with the Dharma life, the understanding of reality. It's in connection with that. And it's also in connection with our potential, with this confidence that we are not going to be limited by fear, that we're more than our fear, that we have enough in us to be able to hold this moment and the next moment and the next. And one of the things that Sangharakshita says, he says, when you go to a place of fear, when Padmasambhava went to the cremation grounds, when the Buddha went to the terrifying forests, the energies are there to meet us. Our energies are there to meet us. In the sort of symbolism of the Tantra, the cremation ground is where the darkness arise, the upwelling positive energetic forces in our psyche arise. They arise in the cremation ground, and they will come to meet us if we go beyond our self-clinging, if we go beyond our habitual sense of self and enter into the unknown. So it's not about taking stupid risks. I just want to sort of add that caveat just in case someone does something really daft, saying, but Vajratara said we had enough space to hold ourselves. Don't take a stupid risk. But it's about facing fear in the Dharma life when we know it's the best thing to do and we know we've got our practice to fall back on. In a way, it's an invitation to not look for safe spaces, but brave spaces. I don't know if you've come across this, but in certain circles of therapy and activist work, they used to talk about creating a safe space where one can be free to open up without being under any sense of threat. But what they realized is that that limited communication, because if any time anyone disagreed with you, then you say, well, this is not a safe space because I feel challenged. If there was any challenge in there at all, then people would get very affronted and very angry. And it held back creative dialogue because no one wanted to disagree with each other. So what they started to do in those circles is to talk about a brave space where we're free to enter into unknown territory, where if we're free to change our minds, to change what we think, to change our habitual sense of self without being attacked in a negative way. So in a funny kind of sense, I think that that's what we're trying to do in the Sangha is we're trying to create a brave space where people can leave behind the confines of the rigidity of the self that they've created and learn something new that might be uncomfortable. You know, it might be that we disagree with each other. It might be that you have to do something that you're not familiar with or that feels uncomfortable at the time. It might be that we're not beyond fear, but that we're brave enough to step into fear and to take that kind of embodied interest in what fear shows us. So the Buddha said that if we enter into that brave space where fear arises, if we enter into fear with a mindfulness of and embodied engagement, it will lead to the dhyanas and then the three knowledges. So it's very interesting that that's what follows, because he's saying that in a way, if we can step beyond the confines of this rigid self that we've created that's circling around fear and the avoidance of fear, if we can step beyond that, what will meet us are profoundly positive states of being, profoundly open states of being. Our consciousness will open up, will release itself into a fuller experience of the mind and body, the full experience of the present moment. And then we start to become aware of the deeper levels of reality itself. We start to become aware of not just our current life, but all our lives and everybody's lives. We see reality unfolding, lives passing over into one another, and we see how the whole thing is bound up with conditioned arising. We see the whole flux of reality, and then within that we see that we are free. We see that we are able to go forth from suffering, to go forth from the mental poisons. And we are liberated. We've stepped completely and utterly into the unknown, the unborn, the uncreated. And when he did this, when he reached this level, the Buddha didn't need to go into the forest. But he enjoyed going into the forest. He said he still enjoyed going into the forest. But he didn't need to go into the forest to combat his fear. He just enjoyed it. And he was compassionate for others. He wanted to give other people an example to follow. And that implies that he knew it was helpful to feel fear. He knew it was helpful to face fear, to go through it and not round it, because it's such a central feature of our experience. And there's a gift that comes if you're brave enough to go through fear. And that when we can work with our own fear, we can give the gift of fearlessness. So the other thing that Bhante says is, he says, the gift of the Dharma is verbal, and the gift of fearlessness is the gift of one's own personality. You can't tell someone to be unafraid. You have to be unafraid yourself. So the gift of fearlessness is the gift of who you are. And communicating fearlessness to others by being fearless ourselves. The gift of fearlessness is who we are, not what we say. And it's a gift because it's the culmination of all our spiritual practice, everything that we've done in the Dharma life so far. Our practice of ethics, meditation, wisdom has led us to this point. And it communicates something very, very strong to people, which is what it's like to be without fear, or at least to be able to work creatively with fear and not be defined by it. And I think this is something that we can really, really do. It's the gift of our own practice that we can communicate to others just by who we are, hanging around a Buddhist center, offering someone a cup of tea, you know, being friendly to someone's mum when they come along. And it's not something you have to work out or say something incredibly clever or, you know, say some sort of the perfect thing that's going to make them realize the Dharma. You communicate a lot just by who you are. And that's what the Buddha did. You know, the Buddha, there's a story of Yasa, where Yasa's running from a scene of carnage, which was his own party. Anyway, you might or may not know the story. I won't go into it in depth, but he runs away from the palace, from the sort of dregs of his party, saying, "This is frightening. This is horrible." It was a vision of the horror of his own life. And he runs into the park saying, "This is frightening. This is horrible." And he sees the Buddha standing there. And the Buddha turns to him mindfully and says, "This is not frightening. This is not horrible." And Yasa is transformed right there and then, because the presence of the Buddha was immensely powerful in itself. This is not frightening. This is not horrible. There's a verse from the Therigatha which says, "Go and see the golden teacher with his golden skin, who tames the wildness of our minds and is enlightened, unafraid." Go and see the golden teacher with his golden skin, who tames the wildness of our minds and is enlightened, unafraid.